everybody. Welcome once again to that weekly game show, Quick Trivia with Mike. I'm your host and quizmaster, Mike Brever. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in today. You know all about our show by now, don't you? It's a weekly challenge for you where we test you with some obscure facts. A little bit challenging, but hopefully always a lot of fun. Thanks for tuning in. You know, we always begin our show by going over the answers to last week's questions. We always have 3 questions for you. After we give you the answers to last week's, we give you 3 new questions for the coming week, and we always announce a winner from the previous week as we're doing so. Let's get right into it, shall we? We talked last week in our first question a little bit about pandemics and their influence on the city of Milwaukee. We talked about the fact that the coronavirus that we're currently experiencing right here in Milwaukee and of course around the world. But in Milwaukee, as of last week, we had experienced 549 deaths. Our population is about 592,000. 0.09% of the population has tragically passed as a result of the coronavirus. We talked about the Spanish flu from 1918 to 1920. Broke out just as World War I was ending, and unfortunately it spread throughout the globe. Because, in fact, primarily because of World War I, soldiers took it with them wherever they went. The population of Milwaukee at that time was 457,000. We had 1,292 deaths. 0.28% of the population of Milwaukee tragically succumbed to that epidemic. We pointed out to you, however, though, based on a percent of population, there was one pandemic that struck in the 19th century, the mid-1800s, that resulted in 1.5% of the population of Milwaukee passing tragically. It isn't as well remembered as the others because the population was only 20,000 citizens at the time. There were 300 deaths. That totals to 1.5% of the population. We asked you what that pandemic was and when it occurred. Well, I've already given you the answer. It occurred in 1850. The epidemic, cholera. Cholera was something that nobody knew anything about in the 1850s. And when it hit in the Milwaukee area, it was just devastating. There actually were very few things that were more dangerous to a booming city than infectious disease, and cholera, of course, was the worst at the time. It really threatened the economic and political stability of society at that time, in addition to the tragic health consequences of it. So that's the answer to the question. Cholera, in fact, as it was known in those days as King Cholera, it really had a devastating impact on the city of Milwaukee. In fact, in approximately 1950, which was 100 years after the fact, an unmarked graveyard was discovered as a new school was being built in the city of Milwaukee. There were bones from dozens of people just loosely thrown in the ground, only about a foot deep. People were so terrified of cholera at that time, they would do anything to sequester themselves from the victims to try to keep it from spreading more. It was a function of how deadly the disease was and how little we knew about how it spread and how to combat it. Very much like the Dark Ages when the Black Plague devastated Europe. The lack of knowledge really was what made it such a horrible disease. So cholera was the answer to question number 1, and it occurred in 1850 And by percent of population, it actually is the worst epidemic that ever has hit the city of Milwaukee. Of course, the ultimate devastation of coronavirus is yet to be known. We'll hope that we come up with a vaccine soon and hopefully a cure, and we can keep cholera as the most devastating pandemic that's ever affected the city of Milwaukee. Our second question. We talked to you a little bit about the history of Halloween. We talked about jack-o'-lanterns and how they have become the face, if you will, of Halloween here in the United States and in many cases throughout the world as well. The carving of pumpkins with a face. We told you a little bit about the history of it. Interestingly enough, pumpkins are also very famous as a culinary treat. Pumpkin pie. It is the inside of the pumpkin, the meat of it, not the innards and the seeds and things like that that really make that pie. It's the solid component on the inside of the pumpkin that's scraped off and becomes the filling for a pumpkin pie, actually. And of course, the pumpkin seeds are a delicacy as well. My wife and I had 4 children, and really a fun thing for us every Halloween. Carve the pumpkins, bake the pumpkin seeds. A wonderful treat that we had in the house for 2 or 3 weeks after that as we got through them all. I mentioned to you that many of the current things that we do to enjoy Halloween, specifically the carving of jack-o'-lanterns, came over from Europe. But when it came from Europe, pumpkins were not the #1 thing that Europeans did. What was it that Europeans carved? And specifically the Irish, when they came here in the potato famine of the 1840s, what was it that they carved to create their jack-o'-lanterns? The answer? Turnips. Turnips were what the Irish used, and that created the carving craze here in the United States. One of the reasons that happened is that pumpkins are native to North America. They were not in European nations prior to the discovery of the Americas. And that's why it's a wonderful tradition, but the Europeans used whatever they had, and it turned out that what they had was turnips. The pumpkin, of course, is native to the continent of North America. The oldest evidence, pumpkin-related seeds dating back 7,000 years before Christ. Those seeds were found in Mexico. The pumpkin, of course, was a very early export because of its ease in growth and because of its ease in turning into food. It was first exported from North America to France, and it spread throughout. Of course, one of the reasons it spread so quickly was because the seeds adjust to a climate so well. Pumpkins grow in Europe now just as prevalently as they do here in the United States. Ironically, we talked about how a pumpkin is used for food, pumpkin pies in particular. Pumpkin pie did not become an addition to the Thanksgiving dinner until the early 19th century. Pilgrims brought the pumpkin pie back from Europe to New England, while the English method of cooking the pumpkin took a different course. In the 19th century, the English pumpkin pie was prepared by stuffing the pumpkin with apples, spices, and sugar, and then baking it whole. So ironically, North America exported pumpkins to Europe. Europe brought back some of the recipes that they used to make, specifically pumpkin pie. But that is the answer. The Irish brought the tradition of jack-o'-lanterns back from Europe, but they originally used turnips. Our third question we dealt off, as you know I like to do. We looked a little bit at baseball. Baseball here in Milwaukee. We talked a little bit about the history of no-hitters and the history of perfect games. Of course, a no-hitter is a game in which for 9 innings, a team does not get a single hit. A perfect game means 27 up and 27 down. Not only does nobody get a hit, but nobody gets on base. I told you that in 1959, specifically May 26, 1959, a momentous event occurred at Milwaukee County Stadium. The Braves in that game were playing the Pittsburgh Pirates, and there was a pitcher who pitched 12 innings of perfect ball. Yet he was never credited with either a no-hitter or a perfect game. And I asked you why. I asked you who it was and why. And the answer was Harvey Haddix, a pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates. He pitched 12 innings of perfect ball. What ended up happening was that he lost the game in the 13th inning. Pitched a perfect game for 12 innings, but the Pirates could not score. Ironically, the Pirates did have 8 hits. Brave starter Lou Burdette had given up 8 hits through 9 innings, but he pitched a shutout of his own. 3 times the Pirates came close to scoring the winning run for Haddix, but all 3 times they fell short. Felix Mantilla, by the way, scored the winning run for the Braves. A Little League on the south side of the city of Milwaukee, in the Walker's Point area right now, is actually known as the Felix Mantilla Little League. But Felix Mantilla actually scored the winning run. The real secret to the answer here is that for a game to be a perfect game or a no-hitter, the pitcher has to win the game. Harvey Haddix didn't win the game because the Braves came back in the 13th and won the game. Ironically, there's another story to this as well. In 1989, there was a banquet attended by players from Pittsburgh and the Milwaukee Braves to celebrate that momentous game. And it was revealed that the Braves were actually stealing signs in that game and knew if a pitch was going to be a fastball or a changeup. Harvey Haddix only had 2 pitches in those days. He had the fastball and he had the changeup. Out in the bullpen, out in the outfield, Braves pitchers, relief pitchers, they'd take a white towel and they were stealing the signs. If it was going to be a fastball, the towel went up on the outfield fence. If it was going to be a changeup, towel was removed. Hank Aaron claims to this day that he did not participate in the sign stealings. He actually went up there and took his best swing every single time. But think of the momentous impact of that knowledge now that the players have actually acknowledged it. Signs were being stolen for 12 innings, and yet Harvey Haddix was so good pitching that day that he pitched a perfect game. 36 batters up, 36 batters down. No errors, no walks, no hit batters, no nothing. It took 13 innings for the Braves to finally win the game. So that's the reason why Harvey Haddix does not have credit for a perfect game or a no-hitter, in spite of his really miracle of pitching back in the 1950s. So those are the 3 answers to your questions. We did have several people play. We also have a tiebreaker, as you know. If 2 or more players get the same number of questions right, we use the bumper music as the tiebreaker. The music that plays at the beginning of our show and the music that plays at the end of our show. If you can identify that music, that's the tiebreaker. Well, this time we really didn't need the tiebreaker because we had only 1 player that got all 3 questions correct. Kelvin Schrader. Congratulations, Kelvin, and welcome back to the winner's circle again. Kelvin did tell the correct story about Harvey Haddix. He did identify Milwaukee cholera as the epidemic in the 1850s, and he did correctly identify turnips as what was used to create jack-o'-lanterns by the Irish when they brought the tradition over here to the United States. Ironically, Kelvin did not identify the bumper music. Kelvin, well, first of all, let me tell you, the bumper music was written by Scott Joplin. It was titled The Entertainer. It was written in 1902. Many of you maybe remember it as the theme music for The Sting, that wonderful, wonderful movie that starred Paul Newman and Robert Redford about a 1930s heist, gangsters stealing from gangsters. Just a great, great movie. It was a follow-up to their movie, The Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And that's where this story about bumper music gets interesting. Kelvin identified that Paul Newman, or that the music came from a Paul Newman and Robert Redford movie, but he identified it as the theme music from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. That unfortunately was incorrect. Only one player actually identified the bumper music, and that was Sandra Meyer. Scott Joplin and The Entertainer was identified by Sandra Meyer correctly as the bumper music. Unfortunately, Sandra Meyer did not get the 3 questions correct. She identified the disease of the 19th century as tuberculosis. So Kelvin, welcome back to the winner's circle. Let's move on, shall we? Let's get into this week's questions. Hopefully they're going to be a little bit challenging for you, and I hope you'll find them to be a little bit fun. Again, you know that I love to talk a little bit about Milwaukee history and lead that into my trivia for the week. We're going to do this again. You'll remember a couple of months ago, we talked a little bit about Milwaukee City Hall, but we identified it as the tallest occupied building in the world from its completion in 1895 until it was surpassed in 1899. We're going in a little bit different direction today about Milwaukee City Hall. As I just identified, it was in fact completed in 1895. It was designed by architect Henry C. Koch, and it is in the Flemish Renaissance Revival style. And it's based on a German precedent, the Hamburg Rathaus, or City Hall. Other local examples here, the Pabst Theater, etc., were, I'm sorry, the Pabst Building, not the Pabst Theater, the Pabst Building, which was demolished in 1981, were also built in the same architectural style. In 1973, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So something that Milwaukee actually is very, very proud of. The foundation of Milwaukee City Hall consists of 2,584 white pine piles that were driven into the marshy land surrounding the Milwaukee River. They had to have these piles in order to create stability for the building. From that base, the main block of the building rises 8 stories, with the massive tower at the end rising to 350 feet, with its clock faces flanked by 4 beer stein turrets and topped by a copper-clad spire. The upper part of the tower was rebuilt after a fire in October of 1929. Now you know about the pilings that go down because the ground was so marshy around the Milwaukee River. With that cavity under there between the building and the pilings, it actually became a very early air conditioning system. Milwaukee City Hall was able to pump that cool air from the marshy area around the Milwaukee River up into the City Hall confines before the creation of compressors. It was a natural air conditioning model. The bell in City Hall was named after Solomon Juneau, who was Milwaukee's first mayor. It was designed and crafted by the Campbells, who were early pioneers in the Milwaukee area. City Hall of Milwaukee has also been used as the marketing symbol of Milwaukee until the completion of the Calatrava wing of the Milwaukee Art Museum in 2001. We've talked about the Calatrava in the past. It's one of the questions that I, as the quiz master, actually got partially wrong for you as I was explaining them next week, or the subsequent week. Milwaukee City Hall, as you know, the spire and all the rest of that, created the opening sequence for the wonderful and very popular sitcom Laverne and Shirley. The marquee was removed in 1988 and its letters were donated to the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design in 2012. From 2006 to 2008, you know, the entire building was renovated. Some of the cornices were falling, and of course, in Milwaukee, you have to clean the stone from time to time, re-tuck point, etc. All of that was done from 2006 to 2008. Cost $60 million to do the renovation. And of course, it had to be redone. Only 4 years later, when pieces started to fall off in 2012. So not really a very good job that was done from during the original renovation from 2006 to 2008. I hope Milwaukee got their money back on that $60 million, or they at least got the second renovation paid for free. I'm not sure. We'll find out about that. My question to you, though, about Milwaukee City Hall is that in 1940, immediately after the term of Dan Hone as mayor of Milwaukee, at a cost of $2,500, an architectural amenity was added to the interior of City Hall. And it was a major architectural amenity, which actually stood in place until the mayoral administration of John Norquist in the 1980s. What was that architectural amenity in 1940 that was installed in City Hall that cost $2,500? That is question number one. Question number two. You also know that I love to deal a little bit with history. We're going to go back into the era immediately preceding World War II. We're going to look a little bit at Germany, specifically the Third Reich. Things were going very well with the Weimar Republic after the end of World War I until the Great Depression of 1929. An economic freefall took place worldwide. We think of the Great Depression as its influence on the city of Milwaukee and on the United States, because we all know that it was precipitated by a stock market plunge on Wall Street. But it affected the entire world. It ultimately led to the collapse of the Weimar Republic. On September 30th, in September of 1930, the National Socialist Party, the Nazis, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, gained some seats in the Reichstag for the very first time. Through a series of political maneuverings, on January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor. He was still Chancellor in spite of the fact that he represented a minority party based on membership in the Reichstag. Much of that ended on February 27th of 1933 when there was an infamous fire in the Reichstag, their parliament building. Nobody really knows how the fire started. Of course, Hitler and his minions blamed minority parties in Germany at that time. They used it as a propaganda tool to gain additional power. In July of 1933, the Nazis declared that there was only one party left in Germany, and it was the National Socialists, or the Nazi Party. You know how that all then progressed into World War II. Hitler went on a massive public works venture, not only rebuilding the armed forces, the Air Force and the Wehrmacht, the Army. But he also worked to rebuild the Autobahns or to create the Autobahns in Germany at that time. Ironically, as much as they are now symbolic with Germany and how they were much heralded during their construction in the 30s, the Autobahns never really got to be used by the German populace. All during the 30s they were being built, people went back to work, there was money flowing through the economy at that time. However, by the time they were done and ready to be used, war had broken out, and the Autobahns were of the exclusive use of the military to get troops quickly through Germany at that time. In 1938, in March, Austria was occupied by Germany. In September, Sudetenland was occupied by Germany, and ultimately, on September 1st, 1939, the invasion of Poland created the formal origination of World War II as we know it. All kinds of heinous things happened. Up to 60 million people died. The siege of Stalingrad, the extermination camps in an effort to eliminate Jews throughout Europe. Horrible time for the entire world, brought on by this senseless act. An interesting thing, and somewhat of a trivia thing though, is one of the things that happened in Germany during the entire era of the Third Reich. Basically from 1934 until 1945, May of 1945, when Germany surrendered about a week and a half after the suicide of Adolf Hitler. But from that period of time, roughly 11 years, every time a young couple got married in Germany, the government of Germany presented the new married couple with a gift. What was the gift that the government of Germany presented to a new married couple during the entire reign of the Nazi administration in Germany? What was that gift? That's question number 2. Question number 3, we're going to stay on World War II, but we're going to come back to the United States. We're going to take a look at the draft, the selective service. By the summer of 1940, as Germany occupied France, America started to support the return of the draft. I think people were starting to recognize that, hey, this may involve us someday, and we better start getting ready. One national survey found that 67% of the respondents believed that a German-Italian victory, which at that time, really was looming. I mean, the Axis forces were on the march. But 67% of the respondents deemed that it would endanger the United States, and that 71% supported the immediate adoption of compulsory military training for all men. Similarly, a November 1942 survey of American high school students found that 69% favored compulsory post-war military training. President Roosevelt's signing of the Selective Training and Service Act, or as we know it, the draft, on September 16, 1940 became the first peacetime draft in the United States. It also established the selective service system as an independent agency responsible for identifying young men and facilitating their military service. Roosevelt named Lewis B. Hershey to head the system on July 31st, 1941, where he actually remained until 1969. The act originally set up a cap of 900,000 men to be trained at any given time and limited military service for up to 12 months unless Congress deemed it necessary to extend the service in the interests of national defense. That's 1940. Of course, all of that changed on December 7th, 1941. After the Pearl Harbor attack, the selective service was further amended. December 19th, didn't take long, 12 days later, extended the term of service to the duration of the war plus 6 months, and required the registration of all men aged 18 to 64 years of age. During World War II, 49 million men were registered. 36 million were classified. 10 million were actually inducted. December 5th, 1942, by presidential executive order, we closed the voluntary enlistment for all men ages 18 to 37 for the duration of the war. We weren't accepting enlistees anymore. We were looking at people who weren't drafted as providing for the nation's home front and manpower tool. It was estimated that these changes would increase the ratio of men drafted from 1 out of 9 of our male population to 1 out of 5. The Commission's goal was to have 9 million men in the armed forces by the end of 1943. You now know that up to 10 million men actually served after being drafted. Of course, you know, in the beginning, up until December 5th, 1942, we were accepting enrollees as well. So it actually was far in excess of 10 million men that were in military during World War II. This facilitated the massive requirement of up to 200,000 men per month and would remain at that standard for the duration of the war. The World War II draft operated from 1940 until 1946, when further inductions were suspended and the legislative authorization expired without further extension in 1947. Of course, you know there were further iterations of the draft. In my age bracket, there was a draft during the Vietnam War. It was a lottery system, if you will. I remember it was a televised event, captivated men of my age once a year as they drafted birthdays in rank 1 to 365. And at the height of the Vietnam War, 1 through 120 typically ended up getting drafted. There's an anomaly, though, that I want to get back to 1942 about. What was the first word written on a World War II draft notice telling a young man that he was to report for training? What was the salutation that was the first word written on a World War II draft notice telling a young man he was to report for training? And I ask you to be specific. So that's it. What was the salutation on your draft notice in World War II? I know there are some people here that are still warriors from World War II. Some volunteered, some got drafted. Maybe that'll give some people, if some people probably still have their draft notice, whether it was World War II or the Vietnam era or whatever. But that is question number 3. Once again, I ask you to pay close attention to the bumper music that we had as we came into the show and as we ended the show. That will be your tiebreaker. As always, get your answers to me by noon on Monday. Maybe you can enter the winner's circle next week, just like Kelvin Schrader did this week. You can get your answers to me by email, mbereaver@eastcastleplace.com, by phone, 963-8425. I know I gave you those way too fast for you to write down. Just call the front desk. They'll give you my email address or my desk phone. You can also write down your answers on a piece of paper, put them in my mailbox behind the receptionist, or slide them under my front door. I'll find them on Monday when I come into work, and once again, maybe you'll be in the winner's circle. As always, I'd like to thank the management of Channel 955 right here at East Castle Place. The president of Channel 955 ECTV, Tyler Gudex, our general manager, Laura Wengler, our producer, our executive producer, of course, and my specific producer here, Scott McFerrin. He's here for every show. You don't always see him, but he's here. And of course, my artistic director, Cooper Ledvinow. Scott and Cooper also are very, very helpful. Cooper in particular this show. He gave me a lot of insight on questions, and I'm always open to that. Maybe if you have thoughts for some trivia questions, send them over. Maybe you'll see some of your questions highlighted on future shows. But that's our show for this week. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. This has been Quick Trivia with Mike. I'm your host and your quiz master, Mike Brever. Until next week, I ask you all to please stay safe, stay smart, and please be patient. We will get through this if we all stay East Castle Place strong. So long, everybody. I hope to see you again next week.